Hello everyone, welcome to our feature discussion, which is going to cover, about 50 years of Coronation Street.
Just a little quick recap of 50 years today is the plan.
Don't settle down to do anything prolonged while you're listening to this, because we're going to be very quick.
Well, I don't know what we're going to do. It just feels like, we've been on a bit of a journey on the podcast in the last 2.5 years, and it feels like we need to have some kind of concluding thoughts about it, doesn't it?
I don't know, it makes me feel like I'm auditioning for The Voice or something.
We're auditioning for Corrie Archivist with this podcast here. But no, I just it was just before the start of the pandemic. We decided that we wanted to go back and rewatch all of the DVDs, didn't we? Because I can't remember what the company is that released them now, but around about the time of the 50th anniversary, they released sets of DVDs which had like 80 episodes per decade, and it was something that we hadn't really touched on before. And we thought, well, because it was the 60th anniversary of Coronation Street that year, it would probably be a nice idea to get something done and go back in time. It'd be good for the podcast to be able to talk about it. It'd be good for our previous knowledge of the characters to kind of. Because there are lots of characters back from especially the first 20 years, I'm going to say, for me, of the show that I'd read a lot about, seen about in clip shows, maybe watched the odd episode here and there, but that was about it. And, we've been doing the podcast for 8 years by that point, or nearly 8 years, and it felt like we needed to know a bit more, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
I can't remember, what was your kind of existing knowledge before then? Was it... I guess even less, because you'd only started watching it on TV in the early 2000s.
I only watched it when you made me watch it.
to try and woo you in university.
What, you wooed me?
Yeah, definitely. I wooed you in my Corrie.
It worked, didn't it?
It did, yeah, although 20 years later.
I really didn't know. It's really annoying. I wish we had set down some initial thoughts about what we thought we were going to see and who people were, because I always remember you talking about the women of the snug, Ina, Minnie and Martha, and thinking, these people sound like, I don't know, I guess because everybody has this in their country, but you have your distant kind of history of monarchs and leaders and all these kind of influential people, and you lots of times don't really know that much about them, but except for their reputations and sort of vague kind of stories. And that's how I kind of felt about some of the big names of Coronation Street. I knew they were important and significant, but I didn't really know all that much about them, and I just kind of felt like I didn't know what I was talking about a lot of the time. So I was quite excited to kind of give myself a bit more legitimacy. Yeah,
because by then we'd done so many discussions about old Coronation Street. We'd done character profiles of a lot of the old characters. We'd done discussions of topics that included reference to old episodes, but we hadn't really seen any of it. I'd seen the earliest back that I had seen before all of this was somewhere around the early 1980s, because I used to watch it on Granada Plus, but that was in the late 1990s anyway, so a lot of that was a bit in the distant past by then. The 60s and 70s really were a total blank for me. I'd literally just seen the odd episode here and there, although I think, come and think about it, when another thing that they released around the 50th anniversary, do you remember that big gold box set of Corrie episodes?
Yeah.
We had that. I think we had two versions of that. I think we bought one for ourselves, and we were gifted one by my great aunt. And we must have watched that at the time. Again, that would have been before the podcast started. I think we did. I'm pretty sure that we did. I probably made you do that as well.
Probably.
We were just watching it for fun, and this time we were watching it for fun, but it was also to for the podcast, because we needed to sound a little bit more legitimate, like you said.
I wonder whether I saw the first episode before. I can't remember.
I really don't know.
No, it's annoying.
I don't know. What I was expecting from the early episodes, I think I might have thought that they were going to be a bit slow and boring in parts.
One thing I have to say is that before we did our rewatch, we would still get sort of messages from people saying you know, you should watch the older episodes, or I think Coronation Street isn't as good as it used to be, or you know, Coronation Street's gone downhill, or you'd see comments online of people saying, oh, it's not as good as it used to be and stuff. And it always used to really irritate me, because I feel very protective about Coronation Street in general. And so when people were criticising it, I was always like, no, don't say that.
Yeah, so was I. I mean, especially when it was going through its dark Kate Oates period in 2017.
We really enjoyed it then.
We really enjoyed it, and lots of people were saying, "Oh, it was better in the olden days." We're like, no,
it really did invite a lot of comparisons. That particular era, not so much anymore. But that particular era definitely did.
It brought out the old school fans.
So I was always
what's happened to this show.
On guard, in a sense, against being indoctrinated into this sort of like this thought process that Coronation Street has somehow got worse.
Yeah. And
I didn't really want to believe that was the case, but I certainly do agree that it's changed over the years, and it really is no wonder. That certainly would be ridiculous if it had never changed at all.
No, over the course of 60 years.
And whether, you know, you can argue different eras are sort of had different focuses, and, you know, the big names are certainly different, and what they bring to the show, and, you know, the viewership changes over time, and what people expect from a TV show changes over time. And so Coronation Street's constantly trying to keep up with that. And so, yeah, it does change over the years. So when we went into it, though, like you, I was kind of expecting it to be a bit boring, a bit stale.
I think I thought it'd be a little bit boring and slow, but I did think that the whole black and whiteness of the 60s episode might make it feel a little bit special, which it ended up doing. I was convinced that 70s Coronation Street I would not be interested in at all, because I'd seen the odd bit of it, I'd seen screenshots, and it just looked, you know, very brown, very avocado.
Very orange.
Yeah, very beige. And I was thinking, I don't like the look of that. But I mean, I was definitely proven wrong, because I absolutely love it now. And as we were getting towards the end of our rewatch, which, you know, as I say, was 2.5 years long it took in the end, I'm kind of getting the hankering for going back to revisit some of those 60s and 70s episodes again.
One thing I think people know about me is that I'm really interested in social history, especially recent social history, and also, you know, depictions of women and feminism, and how people used to dress or act, or what they used to eat, how they used to spend their time. And so I was very much enthralled by that aspect of watching old episodes, and I'm not particularly, this is the trouble, I can't really distinguish that from how I felt about watching it as a show. So, you know, am I interested in it because I feel like I'm on safari, and, you know, in the past, like watching the natives?
That was definitely a part of it. It was a bit like, you know, going to one of those museums that have got old houses that you can walk through. That's and go, oh, what have they got on their shelves?
That's my favourite thing to do. I absolutely love it.
Yeah.
So that's what it felt like. It felt like we were going back in time.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So let's have a talk about, you know, what we actually watched in it, and this did go 2.5 years ago. So episode 403, way back then, because we're on 532 now, I think. So 403 was when we first talked about the episodes from 1960, because the very first disc in the very first box was literally all of the episodes from 1960, wasn't it? There was like 7 of them. Yeah. And I remember we sat and we watched those episodes. It was almost back to back. It was over 2, maybe 3 sessions, wasn't it? Because we thought, oh, let's just, you know, we'll start this little thing now. Let's just watch one to see how we go. And then we got to the end of the first one. It's like, oh, that was quite good, wasn't it? Let's watch the next one. And then the second one ends on a bit of a cliffhanger, I think I'm right in saying. And then the third one follows straight on after it. And before you know it, the 60s, we'd just wolfed our way through. And then over time, it just became a little thing to dip into every now and then. We'd always try and watch a handful of episodes at the weekend. Sometimes when there were days that Corrie wasn't on, like Tuesdays or Thursdays, we might watch one.
Say one thing that you're really glaringly missing here.
What's this?
The pandemic.
Oh yeah, oh gosh,
March 2020 was when the pandemic began,
and
not only did it change everyone's lives, but it also meant there was less Coronation Street.
I totally remember. I forgot about that. Yeah, towards the end it was Tuesdays, Thursdays, Saturdays maybe we were watching. But you're right. During 2020, especially that period in the first half of the year when I was off work or working from home, it was one of the things I loved most about it was being able to have lunch with you, and quite often we would have lunch together and watching our 1960s, 1970s Coronation Street. So part of my good memories about those old episodes maybe ties into just being able to be at home and spend more time with you as well, I guess.
It really was weird, and because it was also, I have to say, the pandemic was horrific in many ways, and I don't want to diminish the horrible, time that, deaths and misery. But another thing that came out of it was people talking about quite old-fashioned values of, spending time with your family, and people talking about cooking banana bread and, their meals together and going for walks. And the family unit became a very important part of society again, because that's the only people you were allowed to see. You couldn't see your workmates, you couldn't see your colleagues, you couldn't see your friends, you couldn't see your extended family. You could only really socialise with people in your house. And so, in a sense, it felt like the values of the pandemic were being mirrored on screen in a way, because everything was a smaller world, everything was very cozy, condensed and local, and family units were important, and a lot of the things, the modern day accoutrements of life, like going out and having restaurant meals and exotic ingredients, and what's the latest thing, it wasn't around in our lives when we were watching the same thing happening in the 60s, which was a very different time. And those kind of values and that kind of lifestyle, it really felt like I was felt more of a kinship with the people in the show, because of this very bizarre experience that we were going through. Yeah,
and even back in the day, the Coronation, back in the 60s especially, and 70s I guess, the Coronation Street did feel very enclosed, because there was only so much set, wasn't there? So it was a very, very small community, very small area, and it all felt a bit locked in, if you like.
Smaller cast, smaller stories. Nothing was incredibly ambitious. It was all very
They had the odd ambitious thing, didn't they?
What do you mean?
Well, like the train crash, for example.
But that didn't, that I'm talking about the very early days.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right.
It was, so-and-so's made a cake, or we're going to have a flower show, and somebody's fallen down the chimney, or, you know what I mean? It was...
Yeah, it was the sort of thing that these days they might put on once every couple of months. They'd put one of these stories in, and we'd probably watch it now and go, what on earth is going on there? And they would also probably try to put some little bit of a comedy thing in there that maybe wouldn't particularly work, but it was what Coronation Street was living and breathing from in the early days, wasn't it?
And it felt
and
real.
It worked. It worked. Really I thought it'd feel boring, but because it felt so real, I was absolutely hooked by it. So we kind of blazed through those early episodes.
And I just want to also say that it felt very much steeped in theatre and that kind of way of telling a story in an intimate manner, but with the facility that only a television show could give them, that you can see the actors' faces, you can zoom right in and see their expressions, so they played up to that quite a lot. But you had all these stars of treading the boards. Television was very new. Everybody who was in the show felt like they came from a proper theatre background, entertainment, music, singing, all that kind of stuff. So everything felt much more intimate, I thought.
Yeah, definitely. And we ploughed right on through them. But it was also, in the 60s and 70s, we definitely watched a lot fewer episodes than we did later on, because at the beginning of this little odyssey we went on, we just stuck to the DVD episodes, didn't we? For example, in the 1960s, we'd watch 80 episodes in a year, and when we had our discussions, because our discussions on the podcast happened every 5 years, that started off with 40 episodes, and then as we got into the 70s, we supplemented it with a couple more that we maybe found on YouTube. So for example, in the first half of the 1970s, we talked about 51 episodes, and in the second half we talked about 53. So we ended we discussed like 100 odd episodes in the 70s,
and only 80 of those were on disc.
Yeah. So other ones we got from YouTube or other sources. But when we got into the 2000s, and this is part of the reason why it took us so long to release the episode discussions, it's because we were almost doubled our episode count, weren't we? Like the last discussion discussion that we did a couple of weeks ago with the second half of the 2000s, by my calculations, that was a discussion of 101 episodes. So compared to the 1960s, where we had 33 episodes in the 61 to 64 block, to 101 episodes, it was a little bit different. So I think people might have been wondering why it was taking so long to get the episodes out.
I really cannot believe that anybody wondered why it was taking so long.
Because it was like 30 episodes, 30 weeks between the final two discussions, but in the early days it was, you know, every 6 weeks, every 10 weeks almost, that we would have another chat.
But we had more time to talk about
it. We did. We absolutely did.
There were two confounding issues. There was the issue that there were more episodes to watch, and I can't remember what the other one is now, but basically you've got fewer episodes to pick from, and so the storylines felt more cohesive. Yeah. And it was easy to follow what was going on.
We definitely
found that. And as the episodes
that
spiralled into, you know, dozens and dozens and dozens, and we could only watch a small percentage of them, it was more and more difficult to follow the stories. And
yeah, so what we ended up starting to do is looking on Corriepedia and looking at the pages about each year and kind of reading the mini synopsis of what happened between
these. When you say we?
Well, I read them to you to tell you this is what has happened in between this episode and that episode. And it was very, very easy to pick it up, I thought, in the 60s. The other thing about the early episodes, I think, is that there were more episodes that felt more standalone. So it wasn't linked and it didn't matter. You know,
missed a few.
Yeah, if you've got Edie and Minnie and Martha going to the laundrette for an episode, who cares? We can still pick up whatever's going on next.
Oh, that's what I remember what I was going to say now. It's not just more episodes, it's more characters.
Yeah.
And so people are having their own little dramas and their own... And, you know, for the best one in the world, no matter how many episodes you've got, you know, it started off with 2 episodes a week, now we're on 6 episodes a week. But I don't feel that the increase in episodes is proportional to the increase in the characters. So...
No.
You're still missing out on massive chunks of what the hell is going on with Billy, you know. Whereas Moira, she's gone. You know what I'm saying? You go months and months sometimes not seeing anybody, not seeing a character.
It didn't feel like it was, apart from the equity strike, it didn't happen in those early days of Corrie, did it?
No,
it didn't.
So it felt like we've gone from a village to a city.
The other thing, I mean, maybe this ties into what you said earlier about the later episodes, is because once we hit... So I'm going to say that the mid-80s, maybe definitely 90s, we were getting more and more big episodes, more like, oh, we got to watch that one. Whereas they could only fit 8 per year on the discs, but there are a lot more than 8 must-see episodes for the year, weren't there? So I would kind of look down the year, on Corriepedia, and say, this is on the DVD, but we also want to see this, and this, because... Yeah, Coronation Street, obviously ratings have fallen since then. There's been a lot more competition. They've had to put more bombastic episodes, more episodes to grab your attention. So there was obviously a lot more for us to see there. And also we had a few stories where we watched a big string of episodes. For example, in the Ken, Deirdre, Mike love triangle in 1983, we watched a good 4 or 5 episodes in a row, didn't we? Mm-hmm. We started doing things like that. When on the lead up to the 40th anniversary with the tarmacking, we watched a string of those episodes. So it was all just different ways of watching. What were you going to say?
I don't remember.
Sorry. But all in all, if anybody is interested, I reckon that we ended up watching 680, and I think that is roughly, episodes during this long journey of revisiting Coronation Street. And that was about 10% of all of Coronation Street episodes up until the last episode that we watched. So that's not a bad little percentage, is it?
That goes from episode 7,238.
Yeah, but the last one that we saw in 2009 was episode 7,238. So at that point we had seen roughly 9 to 10% of it. Now I was having a look at some other figures today, because I'm kind of in a position where I can say, because I have watched most of the 80s now, although that was 25 years ago that I watched it. I reckon I've probably watched a good 70% of all Coronation Street episodes now. And now I'm kind of thinking, it's probably not that difficult to watch the whole lot. Although, of course, those 60s and 70s episodes are not available. But it certainly got me hankering for BritBox or whoever to put just a whole load
Let us
on
see
it.
Them, please.
But that's a discussion we've had on the podcast lots of times before, and I don't know whether whether that's going to work or not.
I tell you what, Coronation Street is doing this extension to their set, and they're putting in this visitor centre and a screening room, etc., etc.
Yeah.
I really think that they should have a study centre, even if it's just a cupboard with a chair in it. Imagine all of the students that would love to come. There must be so many media students who would, if you gave them access to the archives, they would love to do dissertations.
Book out a room for an afternoon and say, I want to watch these episodes.
It would really
please.
cement Coronation Street's reputation as, the premier soap, the original soap, as a sort of chronicle of British history, to allow people to have that kind of access. I really think that there would be a good idea to have that. It might be a pain in the bum, but I do think it would boost their kudos if they were being, referenced by students.
Yeah.
Especially considering that a lot of those students would be local to the area, and it's good to maintain.
Well, you never know. Maybe they have got that.
Maybe that's their idea.
They tempt us up there for sure.
One thing I don't want to do is to sort of make it seem as though I am not appreciative of current Coronation Street, or the way that Coronation Street has changed and developed over the years, and the way that it's adapted itself to what people want to see and how ambitious it's become. Because certainly back in the good old days of banging pots and pans together in kitchens and moaning about somebody not getting a job, to tram crashes and cyber stalking and all this, Coronation Street's always been very ambitious, and it's continued to move with the times and impress and tell stories about things that people are going through, and those stories change as society and culture changes. They've just, as I said earlier, had to keep up with competition and do whatever they can to keep tongues wagging, because back in the early days when there was only 2 episodes on TV, it was either watch BBC or watch nothing, and so they've had to do more with the bombast now. So what other kind of changes would we say there have been over the years? I think that was it.
Is that all it was it?
Pretty much. I think we've covered it.
One thing I really enjoyed about being able to watch it from start to finish, as it were, well, not quite finish, was seeing the set extending over the years. That really fascinated me, and we talked about that a couple of months ago, didn't we, when we did our discussion on the changing sets of Coronation Street. But I absolutely loved every time they stepped outside those front doors in the early episodes and going, oh, look at that, that's just an indoor set. And then, a few years would go by, and then it's like, oh, they're on an actual street, but we can only see some of it. And, oh, you can't see around the backs of the houses. Oh, I thought that was really, really interesting to look at. And I thought that in the early days, I was expecting to think it looked really ropey and shoddy and rubbish, but it kind of didn't. I was able to suspend my disbelief a bit. Did you find that? It
didn't feel like the cobbles were painted on the floor.
No.
They did a fantastic job. Obviously, the resolution was not very high, and the cameras, it's not been recorded in high def, so you kind of wouldn't have noticed anyway. But it did feel realistic.
Yeah, it did. They did a.
It didn't feel like you were
job.
watching. Basically it was a play.
Yeah, it was. And there were also, there were the odd bits where, like, the boom would drop into the shop.
Oh, we used to have...
that used to be a real fun...
The
first few months, we would, go, who could be the first to shout out, boom, whenever we saw it drop in. But it didn't matter. It was... you could just suspend all disbelief and enjoy it for what it was. And I did find those 60s and 70s episodes absolutely fascinating because they were so new to me. And... yeah, I just loved them. I loved the characters. I loved the humour, and we talk about Ian McLeod's talked about classic Corrie humour, bring it back, and I always used to think, oh, what was it that funny in the olden days? It really was, wasn't it? It was a lot more gentle. There wasn't the kind of the sexy innuendo humour or anything like there is now, particularly.
I think the characters in themselves were funnier.
Yeah,
I think
there's
there
naturally
are
not trying to be funny, not like this is a comedy character, but like somebody like
just witty.
Yeah,
I think there are a lot of people on Coronation Street who had good banter, but I think now I can tell you off the top of my head, a dozen characters who do not have any sense of humour whatsoever and never really make jokes or say anything interesting or funny. And I don't know whether that's just because they've got so many stories they want to tell and they don't have time, but they can make the time for it.
Yeah.
I just remember people being sarcastic, and I think that Coronation Street can be a bit scared sometimes because they don't think that they think people will get it. I don't know, but yeah, there was definitely people were a bit quicker and wittier and funnier than they used to be.
Yeah, the other thing with the humour as well.
Than they are now.
Yeah. The other thing with the humour is it felt like we were able to watch more kind of standalone. What would happen if these characters did this and were just left to... It was almost sitcom-y, wasn't it? It's particularly with the Ogdens in the 1970s. There's some of my favourite episodes back from that era were just... Let's see what happens when the Ogdens brew beer in their bathtub. Let's see what happens when Stan buys Hilda chickens. Let's see what happens when they have to go down the tip to find all their clothes that they were put in a bag. And let's see what happens. Like one of my favourite episodes was Hilda putting on her posh party where she had her eggs in aspic and everything. And just those little... Still stand alone. Just wouldn't it be funny if sort of episodes, which don't happen really these days.
It doesn't happen as much in. I mean, there are a few different things, a few bits and bobs, but they always feel like they're woven in, and they, there has to be some reason why that story is in there. But yeah, I think Coronation Street now knows that part of the thing they have to do is keep people coming back. So there has to be a story that's ongoing all the time. You couldn't. I don't think Coronation Street would work now if everything felt very, like you say, one-off and the adventures of so-and-so today.
I mean, we had something a bit like that for the 10,000th episode, didn't we? Which, interestingly enough, was the first time that we talked about the old episodes. When we talked about the 1960s episode, that was also the week of the 10,000th episode. But that was just all the women going on a coach to Blackpool and never getting there, wasn't it? And that was what lots of episodes back in the early days used to be. And it was probably... I mean, if anyone was to say to me, like, what was the first big must-see story saga kind of thing that turned Coronation Street from that into more what it is now, I would probably say... Based on what we viewed, the Ken, Deirdre, Mike love triangle, that really felt like it was stepping Coronation Street up a gear, didn't it? And not in a bad way at all, because the way it feels at the moment that we're completely giving up on modern Corrie and saying old Corrie is the way to go. It's not. I still love all the it's overly dramatic stuff. It's just different.
A different approach for different eras of television, and it only makes sense that they do the other way they are.
But that to me was when it first started feeling like, oh, this feels a little bit more like they've left the old Corrie behind. Did you kind of get that sense?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
So we've said that we were able to discover lots of characters back in the old days before that we'd read about, and are there any characters now that who would you say, based on our rewatch, are some favourites that 2.5 years ago we wouldn't have. It just seems crazy to think that we did the podcast so long, didn't it, without really knowing about the show. We
kept being told this, and I have to say it wasn't really until number one we had the money from Patreon, so thank you everybody for helping us with that, because it doesn't seem like it's a lot of money, but it really makes a big difference.
Yeah,
and
that was all Patreon.
And it wasn't until the pandemic that we had the time. So the money and the time were really kind of a gift to us in that in that year, that couple of years.
Yeah.
So that enabled us to do it. So.
Yeah. So who tell me some characters that you.
The thing is, it's all very cliche. It's not particularly. Nothing I'm going to say is a revelation. Oh, I really liked Steve Fisher, and I really liked, what's her name? Audrey Fleming.
Steve Fisher and Audrey Fleming have been a bit of a gift to the podcast. That they're our new joke characters, aren't they?
They just
never mentioned them 3 years
unmemorable.
ago.
I remember talking about Pat Phoenix and how legendary she was. So being able to see her, she really was magnificent. I think she's amazing. I loved her character.
I didn't know what I would think about
Elsie Tanner
beforehand. I knew that she had a reputation of being an all-time Corrie great.
I knew that Pat Phoenix was a diva.
Maybe she's not going to be right up my street. Maybe she's going to be a bit Carla-ish, who I kind of like. But very, very early on, she just absolutely, she wowed me. She's definitely a mega Pat Phoenix, Elsie Tanner Conver, and I mean her and Dennis Tanner really, and I
Loved
think
him,
he
and
he came as a bit of a surprise to me.
Linda.
Linda, you
Linda
enjoyed
not so
Linda
much.
more than me.
Yeah, I think I mean, it makes sense to me that you might identify more with the male characters and not me with the female characters.
But
so
with
the fact
Elsie,
that I really loved Linda Chavesky.
Yeah. With Elsie, because she's such a legend, when she was watching, in the back of my head I was like thinking, well, lots of people like her, so I kind of need to like her too. But I still ended up liking her. But somebody like when Dennis came along, I had enjoyed him when he came back in the early 2000s, but I didn't even think, oh, I wonder what Dennis is going to be like in the early days.
Yeah, he was.
I knew
brilliant.
that he was in it, but that was a mega
cheeky,
surprise to me.
Funny, brilliant, just wonderful character.
Yeah.
And again, so caught up with pop culture at the time. The being in a band and wanting to be famous, because I really think that that kind of fame didn't really exist in pop culture before this era. You had your big bands and singers and actresses and things and actors, but this kind of way of making your name through the entertainment business and being a singer, you're opened up to a whole new audience through the television, and this pursuit of fame was so endearing because he could never really get there, and I loved his ducking in and diving and his hapless attempts to constantly make money that always backfired. He was brilliant. Elsie was brilliant. I also really loved the Walkers, Jack and Annie.
Yeah, and those.
I really think Jack and Annie are kind of forgotten now.
I think they are as well, and I had enjoyed Annie from when I watched the 80s episodes back 25 years ago on Granada Plus. So I knew that I would still like Annie, but
She's
Jack
brilliant.
he was another one that I thought I know nothing about you. We'd done a character profile of him before we started watching.
Why would that stop
based on what we'd read online, but I had no preconceptions at all about whether I'd like him or not. But he was just so lovely, wasn't he?
He was like a gentle giant kind of a man, really.
And a similar experience with Minnie Caldwell as well. We knew about Ena, Minnie, Martha, like you said. They're the names that get bandied about old school Coronation Street.
Ena
Three
Sharples
Women in the Snow
was, a force
legendary.
to be reckoned with.
But Minnie was another one that took me by surprise at just how much I adored her.
She was so endearing and quirky.
And there were like whenever Minnie came on the screen, I was like, oh yes, Minnie's in this. And same with Dennis. Whenever he was in an episode, I was like, oh, brilliant, because Dennis kind of went to and fro from Coronation Street in his first 10 years, or the first 10 years, didn't he? He'd like go off on breaks for a bit. But those to me are my big surprises. And the Ogdens, although they weren't necessarily surprises, because again I'd seen bits at them before, and I knew that they were massive, but even so, despite that, I didn't expect to absolutely love them as much as I thought I would, and have Hilda Ogden pretty much rocket up to my favourite Coronation Street character of all time.
They're legends for a reason, really.
Yeah.
It's not just because they were the only ones in it. Like, you might be tempted to think if you were being uncharitable.
Yeah, and there were some others, like smaller characters, like say Jerry Booth, that I knew nothing about.
Nobody knows. I don't think anybody knows.
Nobody had said to me before, "Oh, you got to watch Jerry Booth. He's brilliant. He's amazing." I don't think they had, but he was one that took me by surprise a little bit, just by how gentle and lovely he was.
It's really interesting to think that these characters who are such household names have kind of really drifted into obscurity, even though the show that they used to be on is still on television, which is not something that anybody ever would have predicted, really.
No. There are certain characters from back then that will always get brought up for classic Corrie characters, like Bet, for example.
Yeah.
But there are other ones that the show seems perfectly happy just to forget about.
Well, I mean, even Bet never gets a name check these days.
Not much, no. But if there's ever, a clip show or whatever, or if there's an article on Digital Spy about who's the most legendary character of all time, like there was one this week that had a picture of Bet on there, so she still gets remembered. But there are so many gems from the early days that do get forgotten about. The other thing that I was interested in before we started watching was, would I change my mind about any characters? Like, were there any characters that I thought I would like but actually I didn't, or that I remember liking but didn't like so much this time round, or any ones that I wasn't expecting to like but I actually did? And that that last one, for me, Len Fairclough is in there. I didn't think that I'd like his kind of character because I don't usually enjoy the builders, the kind of the stern
businessmen.
Yeah, kind of.
Like man's man.
Yeah, the man's man kind of person.
He was a very gruff, very masculine, no nonsense sort of guy.
Yeah, and I really kind of got a lot of respect for that character. He was, mostly a pretty decent bloke. Yeah, he was a bit sly, a bit with some of his business deals.
He was out for himself.
Yeah, but I was very pleasantly surprised with how much I enjoyed Len. On the other hand, Ray Langton.
You did not like Ray.
I
really like Ray because I think he reminded me of it's a very archetypal character of that sort of era of, the lad.
Mm. Yeah, I think because of the laddishness of him and being a bit sleazy, he just didn't. I didn't like it, and the scenes that were in the kitchen of number 5, was it? I can't remember. I lose track now. No, I don't even know. Of Len and Ray sitting down on the table in the parlour. I never particularly enjoyed those.
Oh, I love that. I liked it when they all had to live together and they were like being bachelors together and making the tea and.
Yeah, no, that.
I thought that was quaint. I also am surprised how little impact Carla's made on me.
Yeah.
That's been probably the biggest shock of Coronation
Me too.
Street.
You always liked Carla a lot more than I did, but I always would have said, especially when the podcast started,
one of the biggest characters.
She's one of my favourite characters on the show at the moment. I love Carla.
Yeah.
But from what we saw from her early episodes,
I can't recapture my love or interest, and I don't know what it is. Is it that the episodes weren't that great? That didn't showcase her particularly well? Is it that her current sort of what's the word, in the Twilight Zone status of, is she even really in it anymore? Is that tainting?
She hasn't had a
reaching back and tainting her back.
Yeah, she hasn't had a big story for a while, and now she's kind of taken a back seat in some ways to Sarah Louise in the underworld. And I think when I was watching those early Carla episodes, my current thoughts about the character, which is it's a kind of shame what she's become, were maybe tainting my view of her back then. Well, there was some great stuff, like some of the Tony Gordon episodes I enjoyed, the bit where he got her to think that she had killed his henchman Jimmy. I thought she was really good in that episode, but she just didn't grab me the same this time round.
Now I know Coronation Street's always been very famous and prided itself on its strong female characters, but I think that Carla was a kind of. She definitely was unique when she came in, and that she was a businesswoman, and that was her prime directive. There had definitely been women in the past who had business savvy. Like, you can say that about Bet, you can say that about Rita, you can say that about some of Mike's wives. They were very driven. But Carla was a main character who was a businesswoman, and I don't think that was particularly...
Yeah, in my head, she always sits outside of the main Corrie cast. Like, I don't particularly categorise the characters in my head, but she never completely felt like she belonged to me. You got the people who live and work on Coronation Street, and then you had Carla on the outskirts, and I don't know why I ever really saw her like that.
But I think the reason why she doesn't click with me on a rewatch is that when she came in, she was very unique, and she was a bit of a breath of fresh air. But now there are lots and lots of strong women like that on the show. And I don't want to diminish any of the very strong female characters that had been in the show before Carla came along. That's not the point. But she was unique. She was like of her era in that the interest in, single female businesswoman, that was like a big thing at the time, wasn't it? That was like pop culture loved that kind of female character. Whereas now I think that the show's kind of really very full of people like that. I think you can argue that Leanne is like that. You got Debbie who's like that. Lots of them are like that. So Carla doesn't stand out anymore, and she's not even a very strong business orientated person anymore.
No.
But so watching her back, I feel like her uniqueness is not as pronounced because we're used to that character archetype on the show now. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that does make sense.
I don't know if I'm making
And another character that I was let down a little bit by this time, which is kind of sad for me as well. So my equivalent of your favourite Carla going down a bit was Curly. And back in the early days of watching,
Do you feel like you identified with him?
Yeah, I think so.
I think the same
Being
thing
a bit
with me
kind
with
of
Barlow,
nerdy.
even though I'm not at all anything like her.
No, I'm not really like Curly at all either. But I
No,
think
you're not
when I
nerdy.
first started watching, I suppose he was the person that I identified with the most, and I really enjoyed the relationship with Raquel. And there were still bits that I did. I mean, I think maybe there was an early 90s Curly when there was the Raquel stuff and the Reg stuff going on. I absolutely adored that. But I thought that I would be like, oh, brilliant, Curly, I absolutely love Curly. He was one of my favourite characters back in when I first started watching, and then he's going to go right back up there again. But he never quite made it. It just kind of seemed a bit sad.
I think that you have, with hindsight and more emotional maturity and life experience, have understood that maybe the story that you thought Curly was telling is different to the story that they were actually trying to portray.
I think
or maybe
so.
also, you know, as time passes, our perception of certain relationships and events.
Yeah, I mean, I was
changes.
definitely all for Curly and Raquel,
Like,
and we watching it was like they really were making out like this was a disaster waiting to happen.
Yeah, but they were, but also it's easy. We're primed now to sort of spot like the nice guy, you know, this kind of the incel sort of character. Not that I'm calling Curly that, but this sort of man who believes that the world owes him, you know, a hot girlfriend. And so Curly's a bit more suspicious, and you're on your guard a bit more again about him, because there's nothing particularly amazing or unique or special about Curly that he really deserves to have a model girlfriend. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
He really does feel like a bit of a proto-incel.
Yeah, no, I
And those kind of stories now are telling a penny, but back in the day,
yeah, it was felt more special.
you know,
wasn't
TV
it?
was full of useless, hapless men surrounded by beautiful, skinny women who in real life would never touch them. I mean, it's true. It's still true now.
On the
to
other,
a certain extent.
yeah. So, complete flip side again of this, a character who we absolutely loved back in the olden days, back when we originally watched it before, and still absolutely loved them this time round, was Becky. And
She's so great.
because we'd seen Carla's return before Becky's return and not really enjoyed Carla's return, I was getting really worried before Becky started coming along, thinking, oh, am I gonna like her as much this time round? And we still did, didn't she? Catherine Kelly
brilliant.
was just so good. She threw her heart and soul into that
She
role.
was just totally inhabited that character. Absolutely.
Yeah.
One person that I was a bit of a stealth hit with me was Valerie Barlow, because I'm really proud of Coronation Street for, even back in those days, having somebody. I'm going to argue, I don't know that anybody really is like this in the show now. I mean, Toya to a certain extent kind of is a bit like this, but Valerie was so intelligent. She was educated.
Yeah.
She was political. She was switched on. She was properly Ken's equal, and I don't think he's ever really met anybody like that since. She was sensible. I just thought that Valerie was a sort of symbol for a certain sort of person that I don't think Coronation Street can really appeal to in that similar way anymore. Because even like Toya is the closest, I think, that we've got. But Coronation Street likes to make her look stupid and make fun of her. And they never really did that with Valerie. They never made Valerie into an idiot. They never sort of undermined her. Yeah, in the episodes that I saw, whereas they really constantly are kind of taking pot shots at Toya and making out that she, you know, thinks she's better than she is, and some of the things that she's into are easy to ridicule, like, you know, dumpster diving and eco warriors and all that kind of stuff.
Veggie lasagna.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I really feel like sometimes I think Coronation Street had a bit more respect for its characters in the early days that they don't really have anymore. I don't know how true that is.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean.
I think that Coronation Street's much more apt, because it's got a bigger cast, to throw characters under the bus and change their personalities a bit.
Well, sometimes, yeah.
In service of a story.
The stories
Whereas
come
I would
first,
say
don't
that
they?
Coronation Street originally was more of a character-driven set of, you know, episodes, whereas now it's more, very much so, story-driven.
Yeah.
And, you know, with good reason, and certainly that way you can tell stories in a much freer and easier way than you could do when you were a bit more constrained back in the day. So there's benefits to be had from both approaches.
Yeah. Were there any characters that are kind of commonly thought of as being big and popular that you weren't really into? Like I've said Ray, for example. I didn't particularly enjoy him.
I thought Martin Platt was a stupid idiot, and I don't understand. Was he ever popular?
He's
not
such
a
sure
shouty
now.
little idiot. He's always every single episode, every single time I saw him, he was shouting about something, and he seemed to go
Getting
from
angry,
0 to 100 in the anger stakes every single time something went slightly wrong, and I don't know what it was.
And he went off and had a load of affairs as well.
He just was a sleaze.
They really made him look
sleazeball.
bad, didn't they? I thought that he was quite a respectable character before the rewatch, but yeah, this has kind of soured me on him a little bit.
Did I watch it when he was in it?
I think you saw.
Really
I think you saw the
remember.
tail end of his time in the show
He just
back originally.
struck me as such an insignificant little snivelling wretch of a man who had such an inflated sense of self-importance.
Yeah. Uncle Albert was another one that never really clicked for me.
Oh,
I didn't hate him like you hate Martin, but of the episodes that we saw, there was just something that didn't click about it to me. He was a bit too curmudgeonly. It didn't excite me enough. There were some scenes that were great with him in, like, I mean, after the Ken, Mike, Deirdre love triangle, and he found out about it, and he was kind of just all really, really upset about how it all. Yeah, he was really, really
very
good there.
Very gruff and guarded.
But there are other episodes that were based around him. Like wasn't there one that was his birthday, and they threw a street party for him or something that we saw, and they had some of his old army mates or something come along. It just didn't work for me.
Oh, I did like him.
For some reason.
I did like him. I didn't like Percy as much.
I loved Percy. I absolutely adore
like
Percy. Much prefer him to Albert.
Was like, oh no, Albert's left. We need another Albert.
I think there was an element to that. I think there was. I can't remember whether there was any crossover of the two characters, but having the war veteran as a character trope in Coronation Street was certainly achieved with those two. Yeah, Percy and Phyllis, Percy and Emily, brilliant pairings there. And I also, speaking of Emily, another thing that was interesting about this rewatch was seeing some of the characters that we knew from the 2000s onwards in a bit of a new light from seeing their early versions. Oh,
absolutely.
Because, I mean, we've talked a lot
about
recently about Emily, and to us, before we did this rewatch, she was the old woman of the street. Even when I was like watching in the 80s, she felt like the old woman of the street. So it was fantastic to see slightly younger Emily in the 60s.
Well, I listened recently to our character profile of Emily, and we did not get her.
No.
But having watched her from her very earliest beginnings, I do feel like I have a much more appreciation for Emily and where she's come from.
I really do. And now it's too late because Eileen Derbisher's left the programme. I'd really like to watch some more recent episodes. I suppose we had, but I do see her in a much different light now.
And also Betty too. Betty was so interesting because she came in as a supporting character to
Maggie.
Maggie Clegg, who was the owner of the corner shop, who was a very sort of sensible, No, she wasn't boring, but she wasn't ever thrilling in any way.
No,
but Betty
I liked her, but
came in as like the special guest star as her sister, and immediately just became really fascinating because she was big, brash. She was a dance champion, which I love that about her so much. And we watched her basically turn from this kind of vivacious sort of loving life woman into basically a miserable old...
She was. By the end, she was a big old grump, wasn't she, Betty?
Just grumpy cow that anytime anything happened, she went, I'm quitting.
Yeah.
And it was just funny to see
sad.
that.
She wasn't a fun character in the end.
Yeah, but I think that when we watched her in the first time around, we thought she was funny. And it was always, she was very endearing, and I think everybody really liked Betty. But watching her back, it just feels like she turned into this twisted old woman. And like Rita too. Rita's really interesting because Rita's had a much more colourful past than you might believe. Butter would not melt in her mouth now.
No.
But she was, like we said recently, having fights with people in nightclubs and, having it off with married men. And
early Rita was brilliant, and being able to see the whole Rita and Mavis partnership in the shot was just brilliant because she was such a cow to Mavis, wasn't she?
It's like workplace harassment.
It was for comedic effect.
Yeah, but honestly, you could see both sides because if you had to sit with Mavis in a room from 9 to 5 every day, and she's there going, "Oh, I think I've done the wrong thing with the papers. Oh, I don't know how to work the new till. It's really confusing." I think he would want to kill her.
Yeah.
But at the same time, Rita was just such a mean girl.
Yeah. Did you enjoy Mavis? And so, because there were some big characters that I knew about beforehand, like the Wiltons, like Alma, like Raquel, but none of whom you had seen really before this rewatch. What did you think of those kind of characters? Because they were fresh to you.
In a sense, I feel like they were set up a little bit by you to never really live up to the expectations that I had, but I did really, really enjoy Mavis and Derek. I found their courtship bizarre and fascinating. Yeah. And the one thing that we have to always remember about Coronation Street that isn't necessarily apparent when you watch it, like we have done, is that there wasn't always a grand plan. There was never like from the start, the story of Mavis and Derek was that they would fanny around with each other for decades before.
Literally, there was 10 years, wasn't there, of fannying about as right.
to sort of end up as this kind of, I don't know, a union of morons.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, the destination is never guaranteed in Coronation Street, but when you watch some of these stories unfold in front of you, even if you know the ending, it feels like it was inevitable sometimes, and so it's difficult to see how it would have felt to have watched it originally, not knowing where any of this was going. And the writers and the directors, with the best will in the world, you can have a long-term plan, but you're not going to be the producer in 4 years time. The actor might have health problems, they might leave. You've got no idea where these things are going. So really, in a way, it's a miracle that they had so many long-running sort of story arcs and characters and relationships.
There definitely felt like there were a lot more, and it was much more common for characters to be in a long-term relationship than they are these days. Like, people dumping each other left, right and centre nowadays.
So, for example, with Alma, I knew who she was going to turn into.
Yeah.
I don't know how I would have felt differently about her if I'd watched her from the very beginning, because she came in and she was a bit of a rich, ditzy, sort of frivolous, I'm only here because my husband owns the business. I don't really care about anybody.
Yeah.
And then she sort of developed into a very kind of caring and maternal figure, even though she never had any of her own children. And then I knew also that she had a tragic end to her. And so watching her with Mike and seeing how he treated her and how heartbroken she was, it added an extra layer of tragedy to that story to know that she had a sad ending and that her heart would be broken and then she would die before her time.
Yeah.
So I didn't see Alma in a way that you saw Alma, and in a way that somebody who watched it even earlier than you did would have seen Alma.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to sort of think to yourself, how does a story change when you know the ending?
Yeah.
And Coronation Street's never written as though you will know the ending, but it is always consumed in retrospect in that manner.
That's a really interesting point to make. Yeah, you're right. Just before we move on to other character bits or maybe episode bits,
but that's true. That's true of any story,
yeah.
Obviously.
Another character that I kind of like to shout out that I was really fascinated to see the early days of was Blanche. And we knew Blanche as a completely different character to who she came in as the 70s. We knew her as old, curmudgeonly
basket case.
Yeah, say whatever she feels like, doesn't care who she's insulting kind of woman. And another Corrie icon for being this crotchety old woman. But the 1970s Blanche was so interesting, and it was just fascinating to me seeing her as a younger woman, being a mum to Deirdre, just running up corsets in the front lounge and everything. And there were real shades of late Blanche in her, even though I think her definitely her golden era was late Blanche. But that was one that I was looking forward to seeing before the rewatch, and it certainly didn't disappoint. And yeah, it's just really funny seeing them in a different light now. Let's move on to episodes then. I've given you a bit of a task here, and I've done the same thing, because people might be thinking, oh, I like the idea of watching some of the older episodes. Which ones should I watch? So I've kind of picked out a top 5 on episodes that I would.
Sorry.
What?
Yes.
No, it's fine. Top 5 episodes.
I scrolled down.
Gemma scrolled down on my nose. I'm not supposed to. Top 5 episodes that I would recommend watching from each decade or so. But I don't know whether they would hit the same way if you hadn't seen the surrounding episodes. But we don't need to discuss these in mega detail or anything. But for the 1960s, I think probably my favourite one there, must-watch episode, was the 1969 coach crash. We think we even did a Patreon episode, didn't we, about top 5 episodes from the 60s, and I thought of this one just this week when I was planning this. Then I went back and that was the one that I picked as my number 1 for the Patreon episode. But that being a little jolly out, the last episode, a jolly outing, seeing all the characters in different situations, like Stan and Hilda on the boat, and they're just having a little dance and a sing-song together, some of them. The crash itself was well done. The whole side story of the police thinking... or who was it? The coach company saying, "Oh, that coach shouldn't have gone out," and then
this
trying to catch them.
This was the episode where we began with like a crane shot inside a bus depot.
Yeah, you think you might be right.
And we had quite a lot of discussion. And it felt like a bit like, you know, it felt a bit like a prototype of what Rescue 999 would end up being, where at the beginning you see a bunch of people innocently going about like some kind of dangerous task, and you know that because you're watching this, the significance of it is that somebody's arm is going to fall off or something like that. In the 19... do you want to... What have you got a 1960s episode that you're going to recommend? I really enjoyed, and I always go on about this episode,
I know what you're going to say.
The one where... Ida Barlow dies.
Yeah.
Ken's mother, who is knocked over by a bus, and you don't know what's happening, and you know she's missing, and you don't know what's happening, and you sort of cut to... Again, it's weird because it's similar to your one, where you cut to characters that aren't actually in Coronation Street discussing. So you cut to the police station where they're discussing, you know, oh, we found this woman's been killed, and here's her scarf and her handbag and everything. Yeah. So that's really interesting. But I also really enjoyed the episode which was the Tanner wedding. Dennis and Jenny. Tanner that on the barge going down the canal with all the lads from the show, wearing his silly little nautical sailor boy shorts.
Oh no, that wasn't the wedding episode.
That was the hen do and the stag do.
Yeah, because that was when they went to the hall. The women went to the hall.
They went to whatever that big stately home is called.
Yeah, I can't remember what it's called.
And the lads went on the barge, and that barge is still actually, as far as I remember, a couple of years ago in action somewhere in the UK. That was really good fun. Again, it felt like a jolly holiday episode.
Yeah, I mean, I love Dennis's actual wedding episode as well. That was a very special
I was talking about...
the bit before. In the 70s, I picked Stan and Hilda's second honeymoon. And I think I must have watched that one before on the 50s gold DVD set. But being able to see it after watching, you know, a decade and a half or so of Stan and Hilda build up on the show, it made it even more special to me. And they're like one of, if not my favourite couples on Coronation Street ever. And that was so perfectly romantic, and Stan just wanting to watch the TV, and Hilda, who's lived this rubbish life where everything goes wrong up till now, finally being able to get this luxury hotel away, and he's just there watching the telly, and then you get the woman Stanley woman, which is one of the most famous Coronation Street quotes ever. And I love that at the end of the episode she's there kind of singing away to herself about being in a posh hotel. It was just so heartwarmingly lovely. That's my pick for the 70s. What about you?
I really liked Joe
Dinelli.
Joe Dinelli coming.
That was awesome.
Holding Irma hostage, and
yeah, that was really creepy, because that was after they'd been in colour, and then they went in black and white again, and that really helped.
That was around Christmas.
Yeah, it was a noir sort of effect.
Joe Dinelli was a sort of a soldier friend of Steve Tanner, who had died, and it was him that murdered him, and nobody knew. And so he goes crazy, and he comes to the street, and he ends up holding Minnie and Bobby hostage, and then Stan comes along, and he holds a gun to Stan's head, doesn't he?
Yeah,
and he makes him sing Silent Night. And it
That
cuts away from the action, and we hear Stan singing that song. But then Joe Dinelli kills himself, and it was just horrific and dramatic and shocking because Coronation Street hadn't done anything.
No, that felt like modern Corrie, didn't it? It really, really did. But with Stan, such a beloved character, that was brilliant. And Minnie as well. I adored that one as well. My 80s episode pick is the Mike at the Door episode. It feels so cliche to say it, but when Mike comes round number 1 to get Deirdre and Ken pushes her against the door. The series of episodes we watched up to there was just spectacular, but the dialogue between Ken and Deirdre, where he's kind of shouting at her and saying, "Oh, why are you going out with a spiv like Baldwin?" and is it because I'm boring? And I don't even know if it was that episode, but that kind of little pocket of episodes was my 80s pick. Did you? What have you got?
I think one of the episodes that I feel like epitomises Coronation Street in that era was Stan and Hilda's Ruby wedding party, where at the end we find out that Len had died in a car crash, and it felt like it kind of set the sort of the benchmark for Coronation Street loving to do this. Here's everyone at a party and here's somebody being told horrible news or some kind of tragic event that's unfolding unbeknownst to the sort of revellers who don't have a care in the world. So I really like that. We also had Rita singing and the Eddie going off with Marion.
Oh, Eddie and Marion were lovely.
Everything was a bit soppy and sentimental, and again it felt also felt like a very quaint and nostalgic view into what it was like to be British and working class in that era, you know, having your Ruby wedding party at the Rovers in this room that doesn't exist. Everybody doing speeches and having a drink and eating sandwiches with cress on the top and that kind of thing. I just really enjoyed that.
My 90s pick is Curly and Raquel's wedding, and if I was hard pushed to name one of my favourite episodes of Coronation Street ever, this would certainly be up for consideration. It was the first ever purposefully written hour-long episode of Coronation Street, and it was the one that kind of spanned over the course of a few days, and you got Raquel being kicked out by Des, going to Curly saying "marry me." After everything, all the build-up for the few years beforehand, like, are they going to get engaged? Oh no, they do get engaged, and then Des steals her off her. But the actual episode itself, and the seeing the tragedy of Raquel marrying Curly, well, settling for him, if you like. Curly realising because some woman has told him that she's heard Raquel crying in the toilets, but going through with it anyway. It was both beautiful but also utterly heartbreaking, and I just watched that episode totally enraptured. That was absolutely Corrie gold. The Raquel and Curly story I love from start to finish, and I know I was a bit down on Curly earlier, but that was so good. What did you like from the 90s?
I think probably one of the ones I would like to point out from that decade was one I think has got really forgotten, and it's funny that Ken doesn't really bring it up, but the one where he had sort of felt like it was the end for him and he didn't want to go on and he was contemplating suicide, and Bet comes and rescues him.
That was so good.
And it was funny because Bet and Ken weren't friends, they didn't really like each other. I don't think there wasn't really much in the way of a relationship between the two of them.
Yeah, I think
but
you're right.
There was this kind of recognition of common humanity that kind of really made Bet into such a wonderful character. Like she could sort of laser in on, this person needs my help and it doesn't matter who he is.
Yeah, again, the dialogue there between Bet and Ken was brilliant, and they got the tone of it just right. That was something that was mentioned in the show. Was it just last year when Peter was trying to drink himself to death, and Ken made reference to the fact that is a lesser remembered Corrie Gold one, because some of the episodes that we're talking about already is like, everyone's going to say that as a Corrie great, but that one really struck me by its brilliance.
I really feel like people don't remember that this ever happened, and Ken and Bet are like two of the biggest characters that have ever been on the show. And just this, and I thought it was really, it was such an English reaction too, because they both kind of, well, she basically refused to acknowledge that it ever happened, and they both carried on as if this very life-changing event had not touched both of them in a really significant way.
Yeah, I mean, Bet's a character that we've not talked about too much this evening anyway, but I have many times on the podcast before. I think back before I'd watched the old episodes, I thought that she was just a bit of a tarty barmaid and a very iconic, vivacious, much loved tarty barmaid, but wasn't much more than that. And being able to see,
she was a revelation.
30 odd years of her showed that she was such a deep.
She really
character,
was,
wasn't she? She was superb, absolutely brilliant.
Also, never had seen her in it apart from her disastrous return, which unfortunately gave me a very poor impression of her.
Yeah.
And you know, I didn't really get hype. I knew that there was hype. I didn't understand. It didn't feel justified to me based on what she was like when she came back. And I think that the writing kind of made her into a parody of herself.
Yeah.
But from watching her from the very beginning, you know, and all the highs and lows that she had, and her very humble start, you know, all the way back from being you know, working in a factory to, you know, living in that little bed sit and just trying to land a man all the time, and then, you know, her really funny interactions with Fred G and Annie Walker and stuff, and then turning into a very important figure in the Rovers with Alec, and then, you know, sort of
leading the Rovers on its own after Alec disappears
and
off.
You know, in a sense, she's kind of like the Titanic of Coronation Street, this big, brash, kind of unsinkable ship that eventually hits an iceberg and is never, basically never really, just heads for disaster.
She'd kind of,
in the most tragic manner
she'd earned her
possible.
stripes working for Annie Walker, hadn't she? And I think when she was left alone in the Rovers, it was almost a case of, well, Annie carried on when Jack died, and I'm going to flip and carry on as well. That Rovers is so important to her.
And she's such an iconic figure in, you know, in English, in the same way that Elsie Tanner was for that generation of people, you know, being on the cover of the Smiths and kind of inspiring people's fashion. You know, I don't think anybody was kind of trying to emulate Bet particularly, but she's certainly, you know, she's got this kind of drag queen look about her, doesn't she, with her leopard and a cigarette in a holder, and she's so camp and such a very unique visual appearance, and she never started off like that.
No.
I don't think there was ever any intention of her turning into a bit of a caricature and a bit of a you know, a cult icon. But this is again one of the things that I think that people overlook is the importance of props and wardrobe to some characters.
Yeah. My 2000s episode pick was the Norman Bates with a briefcase showdown between Gail and Richard. And by the time we were watching the 2000s episodes, I think both of us, particularly you, I'm sure you'll agree, were a bit like, oh, okay. We weren't as into it as we were before, partly because we'd seen the episodes before, partly it didn't have the whole kind of social history aspect going on. There were a variety of reasons why we dropped off a little bit towards the end, but some of the episodes, particularly those ones, and also the Tracy and Charlie,
those were really compelling.
Those were just as compelling as they were the first time round. But yeah, this again, it was a two-hander almost, wasn't it, between Gail and Richard, where she discovers what exactly he's been up to, and then you get lines like, "How can it be an accident? You hit her on the head with a crowbar," or something
really
like that.
Funny.
It was just brilliant. It was so good.
I love it.
It was so dark, and there were like one or two scenes of David and Sarah Louise upstairs, weren't there, listening in? But that was brilliant.
I don't know what decade it was. Was it this decade where there was the story with Sarah being conned online?
That was 2000.
That was something
very, very
that
good.
really stuck in me, and it really was partly down to the music at the end.
That felt like a little mini film, didn't it? Because I think that was
Yes.
another episode, I might be wrong, but I don't think I am, that was just dedicated to that story, and Sarah starting the episode going to this internet stalker's house.
Cinematic.
Candice leaving her to it, and then as the episode goes on, it kind of dawns on her that he's a massive creep. and then there's like the chase around the house, the fact that it was filmed inside an actual house rather than a set, it just made it feel very high production value sort of episode. And then it ended on the music and a crane shot at the end.
Teardrop by Massive Attack, which is quite a poignant song anyway. And I think Coronation Street went through a phase in this era of using pop songs, maybe more than was advisable, but definitely for Carla too. Quite a lot of episodes with Carla in them ended with her sitting sadly somewhere listening to some kind of very poignant pop song that has been...
Yeah, they did the same thing at the beginning of the episode when it was Sarah and Jason's wedding and David was in the car. He'd driven out to some wasteland somewhere or down by a river, I can't remember, and he was listening to some moody music in it, and it set the tone for a brilliant episode that we just talked about very, very recently. So
you know what? That would be a good Patreon episode. Top 5 times music has been, like pop music or a song has been used.
Yeah, I wonder how often it had happened.
Well, I mean, they used them for the Christmas ones. We have a montage. They like doing that.
There were times when there wasn't pop music, but it was music. That every so often in the 60s they'd have little scenes.
When Elsie got married to Alan, we had a bizarrely prolonged, like, it looked like a music video, like a prototype for a music video, as they wandered through some botanical gardens, sort of admiring blossoms on trees and things, as some kind of bizarre harp music, was it? Or,
it was like Spanish flamenco
guitar
music.
Guitar music. And then she turns up later with a cowboy hat on. It was very funny.
There was also like the Blackpool episode from, was it 63? I can't remember, where they went and it had I Do Like to Be Beside the Seaside.
And it was a bit like the episode.
Because there was no audio recorded in Blackpool.
They couldn't record it there because of the limitations of technology.
Yeah, so they played it with the tinkling of the old piano.
It reminded me of in Austin Powers where they go to Las Vegas and they're driving in the car. No, they're walking along or something, and all these like Las Vegas icons are going past them, and they're both pointing in wonder at all of them, like, wow, look at that. It was kind of like that, wasn't it?
And there was one, I can't remember what the episode was. It had Stan driving around the streets in a car or something, and they all went off on a little drive around Weatherfield.
I don't remember that.
I don't remember whether it was tied into his ice cream story. Do you remember that one? There was an episode where he has a showdown with a big beefy female ice cream lady. Oh, that was great.
So many hijinks.
I have got another couple of extra picks, like lesser known gems or just fun ones to watch. But Emily's Mannequin Parade, if you listen to the podcast long enough, you know we absolutely adore that.
Again, but I just want to point out,
watch it. Nobody talks about it apart from us.
A lot of these will probably not live up to the hype, because the reason that some of these are so beloved of Michael and I is that we watched them with no expectation of what was going to happen. No. And so the Mannequin Parade is completely hilarious, and if you want to understand, if there's one episode that I could recommend to you to understand the character of Emily Bishop and why she was such an enduring figure and why she's certainly not exactly this person that you think she is if you only ever saw her in her elder years, I would recommend watching that episode.
But there are others for Emily as well, like the episode where she jilts Leonard Swinley, the episode where Arnold Swain tries to coerce her into going into some kind of crazy suicide
pact. The episode where the man who killed Ernest tries to ask for her forgiveness and she's like,
I
shan't, I will not.
The episode where she's going out with that bishop, Bernard was his name? Not Bishop, sorry, the vicar, the local vicar.
And he rejects her.
And he rejects her because he finds out from Percy that she'd had mental health issues. Yeah. And she was so good. Emily Bishop. She's one
there's another episode I was just thinking of, and I can't remember.
Emily Effatry?
No.
Oh, so speaking of Mannequin Parade as well, another character that I can't believe we've gone over an hour and not mentioned yet as a revelation to us is Elmer Ogden.
Elmer Ogden is probably one of my favourite characters.
If you want to talk about a character that is not remembered at all, nobody ever talks about apart
so
from
much
real
more.
Die-hard fans. It's Elmer Ogden.
Ogden
does not get the credit she deserves.
Really was. She had Liverpudlian accent. She was sarcastic. She was dry. She was glamorous. She was pretty. She was a wag because she married David Barlow, who was a footballer. Then she went to Australia and her whole family died in a car crash. And she was also an Ogden.
Yeah.
She really is, honestly. She feels like the recipe for a beloved Coronation Street character. But because I think it's because the actress left under a cloud. And I think Coronation Street has this unfortunate cliquey kind of not reputation, just like history of closing ranks on people who don't fit in with the current.
Well, Sandra Goff has spoken about, she felt that she had to leave. She couldn't.
Well, she said
was told that she couldn't leave.
She couldn't take time off, so she just went.
Yeah.
It's the same way that and I don't know the full story of this, but it's always annoyed me in the same way that for many, many, many years, the credits said, based on an idea from Tony Warren, which is not what Coronation Street is. It's not based on an idea, like he came up with an idea to have a 60-year-long soap. I think that there was some kind of animosity in the background there somewhere.
I don't know.
And then it changed, didn't it, to created by Tony Warren.
Yeah.
And those two different ways of describing his contribution to the show make me think that it can get quite cliquey sometimes. I really do think so.
Wonder, yeah.
I do.
Going back to what we were saying
about... Well, because one of the things that always strikes me that we don't really appreciate as viewers is the way that actors will sometimes credit the producer who introduced their character and sort of revere them and very, talk about them in very kind of
we had that recently with Colin McIntyre, didn't we, and Janet Very.
Well, she was a writer, and it was Kate Oates who was the producer at the time who introduced his character. But there are definitely loyalties and factions that we'll never fully understand, and I don't really particularly want to know.
No, some things are better off not knowing. So it just makes
don't take the shine off of it, but it's really interesting. And I think watching the episodes of Coronation Street has been a revelation to me. But if I am gonna sort of move forward in my Coronation Street kind of podcasting expertise career, I think the next thing I really need to do is to read some of the books behind the scenes to understand what was going on in the the writers' room and the production staff and what they were thinking and how they were reacting to things and how they treated the actors and the actresses and how they were trying to steer the program through different threats that they had, viewing figures and rival soaps and all that kind of stuff. That's probably my next goal.
Yeah.
To try to understand the show in a different and unique way. Because this is the thing about Coronation Street, is there's so many different stories being told all at once. There's the character stories, which is the most basic and simple thing. And then there's the social history of what Coronation Street is trying to tell us as viewers about ourselves and about the society that we live in and the things that they're subconsciously saying without realising, just as a result of the world that they're in, and also the production of the show and how that was being how that changes in reaction to the external forces that everybody's under as they're making the programme.
Yeah, totally.
Totally.
I agree
yeah,
with everything you said. I think you said it a million times better than I ever could. Going back to what we were saying about Irma, it is a shame that she's been forgotten, because when you think about Stan and Hilda, often you just think about Stan and Hilda, but actually they had some great trios. At first it was Stan, Hilda and Irma, and then later it was Stan, Hilda and Eddie, and they were so brilliant together, weren't they?
Yeah.
And sometimes introducing a new character into the mix doesn't always work, but in this case, 3 really was magic number, if you like, for those.
Definitely.
It's such a shame how Irma's been forgotten.
Yeah.
A couple more episodes that I'm going to recommend. Some of the ones you've already said, like the Joe Dinelli hostage episode, the Ken suicide.
What does this come under?
Lesser known gems for me. I've called these.
Ken didn't kill himself, just the same way that he didn't die from falling down the stairs.
Gypsy Saga. That was really fascinating, wasn't it?
That was the word that was used at the time in the show.
Yeah, where this travelling community moved in near to the street, and there was all different reactions from the people, and some people accepted them that you didn't think would, like Ina Sharples, I think, was a bit live and let live, and other people were very judgmental and very open
scared
in their,
as well.
Yeah, very open in their disdain
like
for them.
Len was very suspicious and hostile.
Yeah.
And again, it's a social history thing. It's not just a story, because the story of the travelling community and how they interact with the rest of the people that live in this country is very fraught. But also, Manchester at the time and Salford were undergoing lots of urban renewal, and there were vast swathes of the city that were being knocked down, and there were big areas of like derelict houses and empty empty building sites, and that's what they ended up moving into, wasn't it? They moved into a massive kind of empty space that had been left by this continual reconstruction of the city.
That was very much an issues story before you think that Corrie actually has issues stories,
and it was honest and comfortable, because some of the characters that you were led to believe were very progressive, or no, not progressive, but
but characters you were supposed to like and champion were saying things that as a modern viewer were thinking, oh,
racist and inappropriate.
Yeah.
But that's real life. This is what people are, some people will disappoint you or surprise you with their reactions to people. And that's just how it is.
Yeah, yeah.
So I really enjoyed that too, because it kind of, like you said, I was surprised at how progressive it was, considering it was the 70s, the 60s. Yeah. And 70s. I don't think that anybody was sitting in the writer's room going, we must make sure that everybody knows that we have this opinion because it's the right thing to do, and everybody's going to applaud us for saying and doing and thinking the right thing about this group, this minority group. Nobody was thinking that, but they managed to produce a story. Well, maybe they were, but they managed to produce a story that was nuanced and interesting, and not just what I think Coronation Street does now, which is you kind of get told how to think about something.
Couple more just to finish off that I've of this bit of the podcast. Blue John Mines episode, which is one I'd heard a lot about because that was Roy Barraclough, who later goes on to play Alec Gilroy. That was his first appearance in the programme, wasn't it, as a tour guide? Yeah. And I always thought, going off on a trip, Blue John, what's that? I'd never heard of it. But the actual episode itself was lovely. So some of those early outing episodes, like the tram crash, like the Blackpool episodes, were just lovely. And that was also an episode, like an early episode, that really, really got me shipping, if you like, David and Irma, because they were just so sweet and lovely together, and he proposes to her on the bus at the end, doesn't he?
It was so unglamorous but so sweet, because they spent quite a lot of the time while everybody else was having a tour of the mines,
just
sort
kind
of like lazing
sitting
around
on the hills, having a picnic, and it was just sweet and lovely and innocent.
I don't know if people, because we didn't know what Blue John was, but it's a sort of mineral that is very incredibly rare. There's only a few seams of it left in the country, and
one of which belongs to you. I bought you what did I buy you? Earrings.
I didn't buy me a seam of it though, did you?
I bought you a little bit of earring.
And I think that there are some in but it's really only like 3 mines in the whole of the country.
Yeah, which you can still visit to
and
this
they
day.
filmed that at Speedwell Caverns, which is you can
That's
go and
where
visit.
we went a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Annie's car in the lake was a fun. This is just kind of ones that are fun to watch. Where was it? Fred G he wants to take Bet out for a drive, doesn't he? Because he wants to be a bit leery with her and a bit.
He wants to be
grim.
handsy.
And then Bet invites Betty along, and he kind of has to go along with it. And then one thing leads to another, and they're sitting in Annie Walker's posh car, a Rover in the middle of the lake. That was hilarious. The Vincent Clare episode where Vera uncovers that Jack's gone to a dating agency under the name of Vincent Clare, and she dresses up as Carol Monroe to try and trick him. That was hilarious, and that's one of my favourite comedy scenes ever, where he goes and finds her in the pub, and she's like, "Hey, it's a pleasure to meet you." Absolutely love it. And also,
and then she chases him out as everybody in the Rovers goes, "Hooray! Domestic violence!"
And he's like, "And you're not a widow either, are you?" And she says, "No, but I will be 10 minutes after I get you home." Jack and Vera.
Classic.
I thought they were. You didn't get into them as much, did you? I think there were some scenes that were really good. Like there was one. I remember there being a bit of a turning point for you with Jack and Vera, where she kind of. Like she's hugging him close and saying like I'm gonna kill you if you stray again or something, and he's got this look of fear in his eyes, and
it was interesting to me because I only really knew them as the old couple who were sort of felt very similar to my grandparents' relationship, whereby they basically only barely tolerated each other, but you knew they must have loved each other somehow, otherwise where did your dad come from? And so
they were always getting off and just having it off with someone else, weren't they?
I found it quite difficult to warm to them because they were just horrible to each other for a lot of the time. And also they came on the heels of Stan and Hilda, I felt like Jack and Vera were the replacement Stan and Hilda.
Yeah, there was a bit of overlap, but
I don't know whether they captured but again, even watching Stan and Hilda in their early days too, there was so much dysfunction and
really tragic domestic abuse
he's
going
given
on.
her a black eye in one episode, hasn't he? Because she hasn't paid the
And it was
bought the pool's ticket or
it's
something, and
supposed
his
to be
numbers come up.
romantic and funny and
But
relatable.
I can't remember whose episode
that
it
was.
was.
The scariest
but
bit. That it was supposed to be relatable.
What was the wedding where Stan advises the groom?
It was wasn't it Irma?
Was it Irma getting married to David? And he tells David, if they mess you around, you belt them.
And everyone laughs.
Yeah, it's so bad. It's so bad. My last episode, which is just a fun one to watch, is the Waterbed episode, and that's another, oft-cited episode of classic Corrie comedy. But if you absolutely hate Reg Holdsworth, then you're not going to enjoy that one. But I was laughing so much at their antics in bed with him and Elmer, and it was just slapstick Corrie comedy at its finest, in my opinion. And you had to you were laughing away at that as well, though I think you were feeling ashamed of yourself for doing so at the time.
If you say so. This is the thing about the shifting values that you can observe being displayed unconsciously by the characters, by the way the show is telling stories. I don't think that they meant to reveal quite so much about what British values were and how they changed and what was important and what wasn't, but they did. The fact that it was funny and not at all horrific, that Stan recommended that his son-in-law beat his daughter if she gets out of line.
Yeah.
The way that women were treated in general in the show, the way that some people had to fight, but still there are other things that are surprising to me and affecting in a way, because it shows that values are intrinsic sometimes and passed down in mental health. You wouldn't think that Coronation Street was always an advocate for mental health, but I think that they were quite sensitive about it at times. And
even things like when that Sheila Bertel suicide episode, they did have mental health
talking
stories,
about Ken, wanting to end things, and even all the way back to Christine Hardman, who...
Oh gosh, that was another classic episode, wasn't it, Up on the Roof?
Yeah, who was like, I don't see what the point of my life is anymore.
Yeah. And
she kind of eventually triumphs and leaves, for a better world. I wouldn't have said that we, as a society, we've always been very good or sensitive about mental health issues and how to talk about them. But when you look back at Coronation Street, I don't feel like you can really condemn them that much.
Yeah.
For that particularly, but other things you definitely can, like how much did they contribute to this idea that women should be battered about, and it was funny if you hit your wife.
Yeah, I know.
And how much have they contributed to the idea that women are the domestic, servants of the household? And even now you've got the joke that we have about how Kevin sees Abby as basically, his laundry assistant.
Service. Yeah, I know.
But those are the reflections of our values as a people reflected in the television screen. And if you don't like what you see, then it feels like you have a bit of a responsibility to call it out and discuss why it is that it's not right.
Yeah.
So in that way, Coronation Street is kind of useful as a mirror.
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
Do you?
I do. Yeah, yes.
Was it worth watching them all then?
What
do you reckon?
I think so. I'm glad we
feel
did
like
it. It was a massive
than
undertaking. It would have felt wrong for us to carry, to move into our second decade as a Coronation Street podcast, which we will be doing very shortly, without actually having watched some of the early episodes. And as I said earlier, I'm very, very keen to go watch them. Go back and watch some earlier ones in the 60s and 70s, because we especially during the 60s we just stuck to the DVDs.
I think the only thing I can see that's a negative of what we've done is that I definitely viewed myself very much as a proxy for people listening who didn't know a lot about Coronation Street. So sometimes I would know to ask a question about something or point out something that maybe you didn't really know would be a question because you'd seen it for longer and you knew the histories of the characters more. Whereas now I feel like we've kind of lost our way a little bit with being in touch with people who've maybe only just started watching it.
Yeah,
and who don't know.
I guess on the podcast sometimes we can drop more frequent
talk
references
about
to things.
And I don't know if that alienates people.
Yeah,
I worry that it does.
I do as well sometimes, to be honest. But the podcast is always... I wanted it when we started it was let's talk about what Coronation Street is like now. But I think it's natural to go back and and go back to its history, and I don't want to feel like we're alienating people. And some of the character profiles we do is to, in a way, to help people to understand what some of the characters were like in the old days.
Definitely.
But I would, anybody who, if you've got an interest in Coronation Street now, if anyone was to say, should I go back and watch some of those earlier episodes, I would say absolutely yes, because as we said earlier, we were a little bit sceptical as to whether we'd like some of the very early ones, and ended up absolutely loving them. There is a lot on YouTube out there already. If you've got a BritBox subscription, there's a lot of classic episodes there. It was. Give it a try. Watch those first 7 episodes in the 1960, and I challenge you not to be hooked.
I really think if you want to do one thing for yourself as a Coronation Street fan, it should be watch those first 10 episodes that were commissioned.
Yeah.
Because they work so well. And if you ever wondered, sometimes it feels like a bit of a fluke and a bit, like being in the right place at the right time kind of a thing, that Tony Warren managed to capture the imaginations of the whole country and maybe even the world with his sort of stories. But actually he was incredibly insightful and very, very clever, and the scripts are very tight and really intriguing, and everything was sort of well thought out because he had the luxury of time and he could create this world. And I think sometimes there's a bit of a treadmill with Coronation Street, and it feels like that it's more difficult to do that, but it was so tightly scripted, and everything was part of a story or part of a character moment to establish who these people were, and it was so well observed too.
Yeah.
It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't luck. It wasn't just being in the right place at the right time. He really was genuinely very, very talented, and
knowing what people were like.
And it wasn't just that he was talented; it's that he wrote what he knew.
Yeah.
And it's magic what he created.
Would you? I mean, is that the episode? If somebody was to say, like, I've only been watching Corrie for let's say 10 years, so I've got 50 years to go back on. That seems like quite a challenge. Are there any particular era that you would recommend going to first? Because I don't know whether I would. I think I would say don't start with the 2000s, especially the second half of the 2000s, because although there are some great episodes in there, it felt like they were fewer and far between to get to the absolute greats.
I'm going to say one thing about that is that because it's recent, it feels more dated in a very perverse and unlogical way.
Yeah.
It feels more dated because it's more recent.
It feels like old modern Corrie, whereas the old
everybody's
stuff
wearing
feels almost
strange
different.
clothes. Whereas when you go back to watch the 80s, you're prepared for people to have shoulder pads and be listening to Madonna and Wham or whatever. Whereas when you go back to sort of the early 2000s, it's quite shocking actually how dated and old it feels in comparison to modern Coronation Street, even though if you were to ask me when was 2001, I'd say it was a couple of years ago.
I think that some of my favourite eras, I think that the first half of the 90s were very strong, with all the Better Buys stuff, with Curly and Raquel, with Davis and
I love Davis.
Derek and Mavis, with Bet ruling the roost at the Rovers. I really enjoyed that as a favourite era. Some of the early to mid 80s stuff, maybe with where you had Bet and Jack and Betty as a trio behind the bar was a lot of fun.
Really, I think those I think Annie, Bet and Fred and Betty behind the bar was the ultimate Coronation Street Rovers team.
Yeah, I agree. I think they were just
if you want to see the prototype or the blueprint by which all other Rovers teams should be judged, it's that, in my opinion. And
I would also say for recommendations, if you just want to dip in and out and see little bits, then 60s and 70s is not a bad place to start, because there were more individual standalone episodes. There were fewer characters. It was easier to just jump in and immediately get what was going on. Whereas if you were to look at anything, particularly from the 80s onwards, you kind of had to know a bit about what came before. It's helpful to know where this leads to, because it feels like it's part of a thread rather than just something a bit more standalone. I don't know what I'd say is my favourite era, but they're all better for different reasons, aren't they? And and what's next for us is, I guess, moving on and finding a few new favourites from the 60s and 70s. I'm very much looking forward to it. Just before we finish, I got a message from listener John recently, and I don't want to spend too long on this because I think we've kind of already answered the question, because he knew that we'd finished watching them, and he's asked us a few questions about it. But like he says, how do we feel that Corrie compares creatively and of the zeitgeist now compared to how relatable it was then?
Well, one thing I would say is that we can't really answer that question too well, because we can only look back on the eras before we were born with, without perspective of what it was like to be. How relatable would I have thought Coronation Street was in 1961? I do not know, because I wasn't alive. I can't tell you. But watching it, it feels very authentic to me.
Yeah, whereas, but a lot of today's Corrie also feels authentic, but I suppose there is more these days that's a bit more out there.
I think sometimes we forget though
spectacular.
that Coronation Street always was a bit glamorous and a bit, I know it sounds stupid to say, but it really was. People looked up to these characters and they wanted to emulate them, and the thing that makes me realise that was true is how out of control Elsie Tanner's wardrobe got, because Pat Phoenix became a very much celebrity of the time, very much spoken about, very glamorous, sexiest thing on TV, and she had to be reined in to control Elsie Tanner's wardrobe, because she used to buy a lot of the pieces herself, and she wanted to sort of make her character as glamorous as she perceived herself to be. And so that makes me realise that actually even back in those days, when everything looks quite down at heel, it wasn't. People were very glamorous and they were putting their best foot forward and everybody looked amazing. Because that's kind of, I think that's, people put on a front. I think people put on more of a front back in those days than they do now. You would not catch Ina Sharples going down Tesco in her pyjamas. Whereas I think, anyone on Coronation Street would go to Fresco's wearing their PJs now.
John also wanted to know about whether there were more issues-based storylines. He says, well, was the show as deep and invested in the issues-based stories of the times, or in your opinion, was it the character-led plots and relationship, community, comedy, everyday, scenario-based?
Yeah, definitely. We've spoken about that, hasn't it?
And when big events happened, were they so far apart that they felt bigger? I suppose that was a bit difficult to judge. It's easier to know if you've watched a whole load of them. I mean, we've spoken very highly of the 60s and 70s episodes, but we have only seen the cherry-picked episodes.
Yeah.
Maybe the ones in between were a little duller.
I don't know. About.
And we saw, when they had the train crashing through the viaduct, when they had the tram crash, when they had the Rovers fire in the 80s, or the lorry crashing into the Rovers and crushing Tracy nearly, it wasn't as big. In some ways, it was as big as the big ones are now, especially the train crash. I think they had excellent production values for the time. But
you're always pushing the envelope, aren't you? That's the problem about Coronation Street, and unfortunately, it's a victim of its own success in that way.
You're always going to compare to things that happened, that have already happened. And he also wants to know about whether audience expectations are a lot less than they are now, and is 2 episodes of the week beneficial pacing wise.
We don't know, because we never watched it in that way. We never sat down and watched 2 episodes a week.
No.
And it would be very interesting to kind of try to recreate that.
He says, were the stories dragged out in earlier decades? And one thing that strikes me as definitely not is I've referenced it a few times already, the Ken Deirdre Mike love triangle. That was kind of over and done in a way in, I think, about 3 months. It started around Christmas time, and then it was around March time when it all came out. And yes, the ramifications of that and the fallout of that kept on going for the next couple of decades in a way. But
didn't it feel a bit like the timescales were a bit more realistic and normal than they are now?
Yes, because these days it literally does feel like there are 3 days in a week, whereas back then we were led to believe that days had passed between the episodes.
But also, now we have, I'm going to live in Spain by in a week. I don't remember there ever being a story. I'm not sure.
Difficult to say without being able to see them in real time. But anyway, that was kind of it from John. But I think as the discussion,
hopefully John feels like we've answered a lot of these.
Yeah.
But I'm really glad you read this out and that John wrote it in, because it shows me that we were kind of on the right track when we were talking about some of the things earlier.
Yeah.
And definitely I would say character based versus story based is how Coronation Street. The biggest shift in Coronation Street is those two things. From character-driven stories in the early days to story-driven stories.
And wanting to have the issues and making a big show of it.
Because the cast is so big, it feels like it's easier for them to select somebody and say, this character's going to do this story. Whereas I don't think they're
you're right. Who would be the perfect fit for this story? You couldn't do that when there's only 12 people on the cast, could you? It's what would this character be doing? What
are they going to do now?
Yeah.
I don't think Coronation Street does think that. I don't know how they come up with their stories now, but I don't think they sit down and go, what's new with Carla? What's Carla going to be doing now? I think they say, we got juicy. We want to do this. I want to do that.
I think they would, and I think that some of the storyliners and story producers and everything would absolutely say that characters are still just as important now as they were back then. But I think that there is also
there's more
they've
of
got
them.
to have the big stories. They just have to, because it's that, and in some ways that does
sheer
come
numbers.
first.
Just through sheer numbers, it can't be that the characters are more important, because there are more characters. You can't have 80 people being equally as important as 12 people were back in the day.
Yeah.
And I don't want to criticise Coronation Street and say that I think it's wrong or bad that this is how they do a story now. And in many ways, it's the only way they can make Coronation Street is to focus on stories and what do we want to say, what do we want to do, how do we,
what's the long-term plan for the year? What's
going to catch people? It's what's going to make people watch. You know, nobody's gonna be asked to watch an episode where Carla talks about, I don't know, or like has an argument with somebody about. I mean, we had this whole feud with Tracy versus Carla, and it was boring. But that was very character driven. But it didn't work because it was boring.
Yeah, that was dragged down too long, wasn't it? Right.
I don't know what I'm saying. I just really want to sort of say that I think Coronation Street has adapted incredibly well.
And it still does do some. Like recently, we had that weird story with Leo and brewing his Dwight Eisenhower beer, didn't we? And that was a very much over and done with. That felt quite old school. We said on the podcast at the time. What's going on in the Rovers? I
think very recently, I feel like Coronation Street has focused a bit more on.
And Georgian is snoring this year as well. That felt kind of classic Corrie, didn't it?
Yeah.
Very low key. How are the characters interacting with each other? What's Todd gonna say next when he finds the CPAP machine or whatever? Yeah.
But I just don't think it's beneficial to look back at Coronation Street and say how can we recapture what made Coronation Street popular in 1960, because it is not going to be relevant.
And it's not fair to say it was better in the olden days as well. And yes, we now have a newfound appreciation for the early episodes, but modern Corrie, when it's good, it's flipping amazing. And sometimes that period might last many, many months, like 2017, which had the Who Pushed Ken, a lot of feeling stuff. I can't remember what else. That was a really brilliant year. That we were loving it at the time. Or sometimes it might last for a couple of weeks for brilliantness, like the Seb and Nina story. That was just as good as some of the earlier brilliant stuff. I loved Coronation Street last year. I know not everybody did, but yeah, modern Corrie, when it gets it right, is still absolutely fantastic.
And it can be a lot more intricate, I think, with the way that characters interplay and how they react to each other and how they conflict with each other. Because there are so many people and so many conflicting different motivations and things. I don't think that Coronation Street in 1960 could have done, like you say, Coronation Street, which was camp and silly and a bit overblown, but it also had some very human conflict and big dilemmas.
Yeah, like with Deb and the kids, for example.
Yeah, and also with Abby and the gun and being confronted with her son's murderer. And
Johnny and Jenny,
that was amazing.
Falling out and reunited together just before his death.
That was tragic. And I think Coronation Street has risen to the challenge of every decade. And it's silly to deny that it has, because it's lasted, and that's why, because it's adaptable. Because when you tell stories about people and who they are and what they want, and you appeal to people's very basic needs and wants and values, you can't really go too wrong. And that's what Coronation Street is, isn't it? It's stories about people and about their very basic core values and how they conflict with other people.
Yeah, totally. So I think that'll do for this discussion. I quite enjoyed that very whistle-stop tour of 50 years of Coronation Street, with a little bit of modern Corrie thrown in there as well. Honestly, if you're thinking about maybe getting started and this has kind of made you spurred you on a little bit more, then that's good. That's what we wanted.
I really want
if you like Coronation Street enough to listen to a podcast about it and you haven't watched some of the earlier episodes, honestly, do yourself a favour.
I really want you to go and watch.
Go back.
The first 10 episodes.
Yeah. Do you like the same characters as us? Are there any surprise characters that you're in there? Any stories that you never knew existed that are like, unhidden, unearthed gems like we found with some of them as well? It's so good. It's a big time sink. And it's interesting don't watch it over instead of listening to the podcast. No. Don't drop us off so that you can just watch old Corrie. But yeah, definitely. It's well worth investing some time in old Corrie.
And even if you've already seen it when it was on, you might be surprised at how your opinions may have changed.
Yeah, we certainly found that with some stories and characters for sure. Yeah. Okay.
There we go. Are we finally done talking about old Coronation Street?
Yeah, but I think we might be talking a bit about old Coronation Street next week, just to warn you. It's going to happen again. But now we are more experts about it. Like we said, we drop it into the episodes more. I wouldn't
call myself an expert.
I think I would call you an expert. I think you're more expert than lots of Coronation Street viewers, Gemma, I have to tell you.
I know, but I'm not very good with names.
There are definitely some people out there on the internet that are real experts, and they can just straight away reference something or get a gif of some random scene or anything.
I would be okay to be your phone a friend if you're on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and you had a question about Coronation Street, providing it wasn't like the top one. But I wouldn't be on a university challenge team with my expert.
Or maybe that's the challenge for the next 10 years of Coronation Street. I don't know. Just before we finish,
the thing is, they keep making new episodes, and I can't.
No, can't keep up. It's pushing other stuff out of your brain, isn't
rejecting.
it? Like even with the 60s and 70s stuff, there's so much that I've forgotten now. Like I was looking at notes that we wrote for the 60s and 70s episodes, and it's like, oh God, I barely remember that these days.
And it's funny because it was only a couple of years ago. Old. And imagine if you'd watched it when it was in the 60s.
Yeah, exactly. Like I certainly know who a lot more characters are now, but there was so much that I wouldn't be able to just reference straight away because it doesn't stick in my brain as well as it used to. But I am almost pushing 40. Just before we finish, there were a couple of things that I meant to mention at the beginning of the podcast that I didn't. I'm going to say now for anyone that has stuck it out for this long. Next episode of the podcast isn't going to be out on Saturday morning. I've got an end of term due with my colleagues at school on Friday night, so we're not going to be able to record on Friday night. I think it might be like Sunday, I'm going to say, when that might come out. So I'm sorry we have to wait a little bit longer for that one. And also, finally, speaking of this weekend, don't forget, Saturday is when 2 p.m. is when you can hopefully get yourself some tickets for our online cast versus fans quiz, when you get to go head to head with one member of the Coronation Street cast with 7 questions about their characters. For more details, check out our social media. We've put up a few posts about it already, and we'll be posting more about it at the time. I don't know how quickly this is going to sell out. I'm kind of hoping quickly, but I don't know. But if that's something that you've not heard about before, you've not heard us talking about, have a look into it. If you've heard about it and forgotten about it, well, here's your last reminder because it's happening in a couple of days. Hope that everybody who wants to get a place is able to get one. I'm looking forward to doing some recording with you later on this month or early next month. And that's it, isn't it?
That's it. That's the podcast.
That is the podcast.
We're done.
We're going to have spaghetti bolognese for tea.
Hooray!
And I think I've realised that I need to buy a present for the cleaners at school as well. So I might go out and buy a present, or maybe do it in the morning. I'll have to see. Right. Goodbye, everybody. See you later this weekend. Ta-ra.
Bye.